Thank you very much for the welcome. I do apologise, I'm still struggling a bit with my voice, but hopefully should get through okay. And afterwards, please forgive me if I don't chat too much. So this is a really important title, Why Biblical Creation is Good Science, because there's a very common myth that biblical creation is anti-science or bad science. So I want to dispel that myth. I have a lot of interest. For a long time, I've been very interested in origins, mainly because of my background in design. I've been designing things for several decades, mainly spacecraft for the European Space Agency, and more recently, Olympic bicycles for the Rio Olympics. And just in the last few weeks, I finished the design for the Tokyo Olympics. Things are looking quite good for Team GB. Just hope the riders are practicing enough. But my background in design has taught me design does not happen by chance. It takes an immense amount of planning to do design. That's what got me interested in origins. I've also worked in academia for over 25 years, and I'll talk about my experience of what my colleagues believe, because I've been really surprised how scientists, including biologists, don't actually believe in the theory of evolution, which theologians think they do, but they're mistaken, but I'll come back to that. And I've written a lot of scientific papers that have given me a lot of confidence in my faith, because a lot of the work I've done has been on things like irreducible complexity, and I've seen with my own eyes amazing evidence of God's handiwork, and it's given me a lot of confidence in believing in Genesis as literal history. And I like to go around the world encouraging Christians to be confident in the Bible. And this is like a summary of what I want to explain in my talk. Really trying to dispel myths. It's a myth that the Bible contradicts science, just a complete myth. This is why there's a great spiritual battle. This is why Richard Dawkins gets so angry, because it's very hard for him to prove that the Bible contradicts science. This is why he gets so angry. It's a myth that evolution is a fact. It's a myth that Darwin observed evolution. It's a myth that all scientists believe in evolution, and biblical creation is bad for science. That's another myth as well. And one of the ways these myths are perpetuated is through the intimidation of scientists who declare their belief in the Bible or Christianity. And I'll talk about that intimidation in the second part of this talk, because in a way that intimidation is quite a powerful evidence, because it shows the evolutionists cannot defend their faith, and the only thing they can resort to is trying to keep scientists quiet who do believe in intelligent design or the Bible. So I want to dispel these myths. Earlier this week I was in Scotland, in Inverness, giving a kind of related talk to this, and so I did a bit of research, and it's interesting when you look back at the reformers like John Knox, John Calvin. They absolutely believed Genesis was literal history. Adam and Eve were literal people. God made a perfect world. There was a fall, a temptation. There was a curse, a judgment. John Knox and John Calvin would be horrified if they thought there were theologians today who did not believe in a literal Adam and Eve and a literal six-day creation. So I'll just go through these really important reasons why biblical creation is good science. And the first one really follows on well from Simon's talk, because the origins battle is a battle of worldviews. It is not a battle of science. It's a scientific fact. Life cannot come from a chemical soup. It's a scientific fact. Evolution can't start. But the origins debate is not about science. It's about a worldview. Either you believe in God or you don't believe in God as creator. So it's a biblical worldview versus an atheistic worldview. Unfortunately, people like Richard Dawkins deny that it is a battle of a worldview. He really tries to make out it's a battle of science, and this is the struggle that scientists like myself have, and Andy McIntosh and others. We try to point out to people it's a worldview battle. This slide is to illustrate that Christians declare their worldview. Lord Kelvin, one of the greatest scientists that ever lived, the father of thermodynamics, and there are various quotes that show he had a strong belief in God, a strong belief in the Bible. A fellow of the Royal Society, Cambridge educated, one of the top scientists. He did not like the theory of evolution, but children and students are not allowed to hear this kind of evidence, so this is airbrushed from history. I'll come back to what great scientists believed later. But in contrast, as I was saying about Richard Dawkins, in general, the evolutionist community do not declare they have a worldview. They claim they're just following science, but that is not true. They have a worldview. And these two quotes are amazing admissions that show evolution is a worldview. Because when modern science rules out special creation, that is really bad science. Because science should be open. But what modern science does, it says it doesn't matter what the evidence is, we have to rule out God. So that's terrible science, to say you're not allowed to believe in God, even if all the evidence in the world pointed to God. So the reality is, Richard Dawkins is not interested in evidence, despite the fact that he screams on the television that evidence supports what he believes. The reality is he is not interested at all in the evidence. So what the media portray is absolutely false. Evolution is not driven by evidence. It is driven by an atheistic world view, despite what the evidence shows. So what is really sad is that children in our schools, in Cowplain, up and down the country, children from the age of 4 in state schools are told evolution is a fact, which is totally not true. All scientists believe in evolution, which is not true. Our children are told absolute falsehoods in schools, and the same is true in universities as well. So this is just a quote from Richard Dawkins. If you read his book, The Greatest Show on Earth, all through the book, he is just saying evolution's a fact, a fact, a fact. But in the entire book, he doesn't mention one single fact or bit of evidence to base that claim. He just keeps repeating evolution is a fact. So that's what he says in his books. Coming back to another great scientist, Sir Ambrose Fleming, another fellow of the Royal Society, another Cambridge educated scientist, one of the greatest scientists that ever lived, who absolutely hated the theory of evolution, called it one of the most dangerous things that had ever been created. He was a president of the first evolution protest movement, started not far from here in Portsmouth. David Roseveare is still running that creation science movement, the oldest one in the world, 1932, the first president, Ambrose Fleming. Again, children are not taught about what this scientist thought of evolution. And he correctly stated, evolution is essentially atheistic. It's just an atheistic philosophy. And we're heading to a point where some scientists, this scientist is also, I think, a vice president of the British Humanist Society, keeps that quiet, but she wants any kind of intelligent design creation banned from the schoolrooms, despite the fact that it is evolution, which is pseudoscience, but any alternative view, there's calls for that to be banned, even from a Christian school. So the first, that was the first the important principle about worldviews. A second principle is that biblical creation is supported by observational science. This is something Simon mentioned in the previous talk. If you look on Wiki, it will say intelligent design is a pseudoscience, but that is not true. It's the complete opposite. It's evolution, which is the pseudoscience. Creationism, intelligent design is absolutely backed by observational science, as the greatest scientists would all agree. I was in Germany recently, and someone was telling me they did some research on Wiki for the Truth in Science website. On Truth in Science, if you read the Truth in Science website, halfway down it says, well, intelligent design, that's just a pseudoscience. Someone edited the page and took out intelligent design as a pseudoscience. It took 120 seconds for it to be edited back to intelligent design is a pseudoscience. 120 seconds before it was switched back. Atheists monitor anything, the creationist websites, and if you change it to a correct state, it will be changed back within seconds. That's how much it's observed. This is one of the spacecraft I helped to design, the Envisat spacecraft. Design is a really difficult thing. I remember designing the solar array for this satellite, and the project manager said to me, do you realize your solar array, that's the solar panel on the right, and he said, do you realize your solar array, well, there's only one solar array on the spacecraft. And I said, oh, yeah, I know that. But he said, do you realize the whole mission cost £2 billion, and if your solar array does not function within 50 minutes of launch, the whole mission is dead? And I said, I didn't know that. And he said, well, if you could think about that for the rest of the project, I'd really appreciate that. And on launch day, I felt physically sick. In fact, for 2 weeks before launch, I could not sleep, and I felt physically sick. And I realized that in my solar array, if I got 99.9% correct, that would be fantastic in a maths exam, wouldn't it? But if I got that, it would be utter failure. And I would have the national press on my doorstep saying, how does it feel to break a £2 billion spacecraft? And that's the kind of thing they don't teach you in university when you're learning about design. But what I find frustrating is that people like Richard Dawkins have never designed anything. And they don't know how difficult design is and how delicate design is, but they write books claiming to know that the world could easily have designed itself. Observational science demonstrates that design does not happen by chance. I've published many, many scientific papers on bio-inspired design and biomechanics. For 20 years, I've been writing papers on the amazing design of the human knee joint, which has a wonderful inverted 4-bar parallelogram mechanism inside that guides the motion of the knee. It's the most brilliant design. It's an irreducibly complex design because you need all the bars and pins in place, which means it cannot evolve step by step. When I discuss this with biologists, they say, and I say, how do you think this could evolve step by step? There's two things they say to me. One is they have faith that one day someone will work out how it could have evolved step by step. The second thing they say is it's too complicated for them to understand. They don't understand what is an inverted parallelogram 4-bar mechanism. They need an MSc in engineering to understand this. To which I say, well, you should study some engineering, because if you study engineering, you would realize these things cannot evolve step by step. And when I look them in the eye, I can tell they don't want to study engineering because they don't want to understand how these things cannot evolve step by step. I've also done work on peacock feathers published in the Institute of Physics, describing the incredible beauty and optical physics in the peacock feathers. Again, an astounding evidence of design. I do whole talks just on the topic of beauty in feathers and bird songs, but I'll refrain from going through that now. Evolution, in contrast, is a speculative science. Children in our schools from the age of 4 are told it is a fact that you came from apes. If you speak to a top scientist, a top biologist, paleontologist, they will tell you it is not a fact that we evolved from apes. This is just one quote. There are lots of similar quotes. This is a quote by an evolutionist who's saying, you often see this picture, the monkey to man chart, but it is pure speculation. It is not based on any evidence whatsoever. A really, really common picture. And it has not a shred of evidence. It is pure speculation. One of the things I find really fascinating in modern biology books is that it mixes up adaptation and evolution. And it's a really strange thing. Everyone in academia knows that popular biology books, like those in schools, mix up adaptation and evolution, and the public get very confused. What's the difference between adaptation and evolution? First of all, why is it done? There's an obvious reason why there's no clarification between adaptation and evolution. If it was clarified, this is adaptation, like Darwin's finches, the peppered moth, just normal variation, and this is evolution. If it was clarified, it would become crystal clear there's not a shred of evidence for evolution. And because of that, it's all mixed up. So when school children open their book and they look up the section evidence for evolution, it talks about the Darwin's finches, and it talks about pepper moths, and it talks about a few other things. But biologists know that adaptation is not evolution. There's no new information, there's no new genes, there's no new structures. Darwin's finches are always finches, they're always birds. You can breed dogs, they're always dogs. You can breed horses, they're always horses. That is not evolution at all. It's a very good design feature. It's a design feature to give you beauty, variety. It slows down the decay of things, it helps animals to recover, but it's just variation. So adaptation is not evolution, but the evolutionist does not want to clarify that, because when they clarify it, it exposes the fact that there is no evidence for macroevolution. For evolution to work, it would need to be driven by mutations, not gene variation. And mutations cause problems. They cause deformity, death, disease. Sometimes they cause a neutral effect, but they do not create new information or new structures. This is on the left at the bottom is the drive gear in a gearbox I designed for a spacecraft. That drive shaft has 100 pieces of information on it. If I made a random change to my gearbox, it would never make the gearbox better. I would have to change 50 things in the gearbox before I could change it into another improved system. Single mistakes do not improve the design of complex systems. Engineers know that gene mutations would never lead to the evolution of another kind of creature or new structure. If you were getting on an airplane and just as you were going to go up the steps, a technician said, by the way, I made a random change to the jet engine. I don't know what I did. I just changed something. I changed a bolt or something. But it might, it might improve it. You never know. Would you still get on that airplane? Would Richard Dawkins get on that airplane? Thirdly, biblical creation is not God of the gaps. It's a common accusation that Christians, they don't understand something, so they just say God did it. We don't know how the world came in, so God did it. But actually, it's evolution, which is God of the gaps. And Christians believe in what we know and what we see. We don't have this blind faith because we don't understand things. Christians have a reasonable faith. Romans 1:20 says God's attributes are clearly seen in creation. We do have faith, but it's not blind faith. It's backed up by what we see in creation. Isaac Newton was happy to say that he saw design in the universe. What he found in science backed up his faith. It's evolution, which is God of the gaps. How did the first life evolve? If you speak to the top evolutionist in the world and say, please explain to me how life could come from a chemical soup. And the answer is, evolution did it. Evolution is the God, and it's the God of the gaps. How did the human foot evolve? Evolution did it. Where did space, matter, and energy come from? Evolution did it. Evolution is God of the gaps. This is what Richard Dawkins says about abiogenesis, i.e. the origin of life. We have no evidence about what the first step in making life was, but we do know the kind of step it must have been. It must have been whatever it took to get natural selection started by some process as yet unknown. So he does not have a clue. He knows absolutely zero about the origin of life. 80 years ago, they started to do experiments, zapping electrical currents in chemicals. And they said, well, perhaps it'll take a week to create life. And then they said, well, we need another week. This was 80 years ago. And now they're saying, well, perhaps we need another 80 years with the best experiments, the best scientists, the best universities. It is not going to happen. My colleagues in universities know it's not going to happen. The facts of science shows that evolution does not work. Do all biologists accept evolution? If Richard Dawkins claims no scientist on this planet doubts evolution. What he actually said was no reputable scientist doubts evolution, especially biologists. What he means is if you do doubt evolution, you're not a reputable scientist. But he would say no biologist doubts evolution. In my university, I know 3 full professors of biology, quite famous ones, who've published hundreds of papers, and they absolutely do not accept the theory of evolution, but they will not explain that to the national media because they know they will be sacked, demoted, tortured, worse. So they keep very quiet, but they'll talk to me in the coffee room and say, Stuart, you are probably absolutely correct. Intelligent design screams from biology, but we can't question it because we're not allowed to question it, and only certain things we're allowed to say. The head of microbiology at Bristol, when he retired, he could actually say what he thought, and he wrote the foreword to my book, Hallmarks of Design. And in my book, he said, evolution is a man-made theory. It's not science. It's a man-made theory to explain life without a creator. He was head of microbiology at Bristol University, incredibly well-respected scientist, and he totally rejected evolution. I have a friend who's not a Christian, professor of microbiology at my university, a cancer expert around the world. And we kind of joke with each other. And he said, Stuart, evolution is like a magic wand. If you want to explain something like the origin of life, you wave this wand called evolution and say, evolution did it. You can't explain it, you just have to have faith in it. He totally agreed that evolution is God at the gaps with no evidence. Another friend of mine, professor of microbiology, I said to him, what do you think of abiogenesis? He said, well, it's just black magic. There's just no evidence for it. If you speak to a biology teacher in a state school, they might say, yeah, well, I assume abiogenesis, evolution works because the professors believe it in the universities. What they don't realize is that the professors don't believe it because they can see the evidence. Fourthly, biblical creation best explains ultimate origins. This will again talk about abiogenesis. But going back to a very fundamental law, the first law of thermodynamics, which basically says you can't create matter or energy out of nothing. You can convert it, but you can't create it or destroy it. And so only belief in an almighty creator with the almighty power to bring the universe into being, that's the only thing that makes sense from a scientific point of view. So God is totally compatible with science when you think of the origin of matter and energy, just the first law of thermodynamics. And then going back to the origin of life, self-replicating life requires vast amounts of information. There have been searches for simple life forms. If evolution was true, we should be able to find a simple life form, a simple bacteria, or something like that, that just has a tiny amount of information, and searches have been made. But unfortunately for the evolutionists, the simplest life form that has been found has 580,000 base pairs of information, and even that bacteria can't even survive on its own. It actually relies on other things to live on. And so when the evolutionists discovered that, it was devastating. How could you ever say that that amount of information could just pop out of nowhere? So this is just emphasizing the weakness of evolution about the origin of life. Another quote from Lord Kelvin. In 1903, he said about abiogenesis, was there anything so absurd as to believe that a number of atoms falling together could make a microbe, i.e. life? Now, when he wrote that, we didn't know the amazing complexities of the living cell. They thought things were far simpler then, but this great scientist could see the stupidity of thinking that life could just form itself. Biblical creation best encourages scientific progress. In the Ken Ham, Bill Nye debate, Bill Nye claimed creationism would hold back science. Well, it didn't help the American team in the cycling in the Olympics. But the opposite is true. Actually, that is what Bill Nye said in that debate. And it's just another myth relating to evolution, creation. I mentioned before, I did a lot of research on the human knee joint. I've had a PhD student spend 3 years just looking at the mathematics of the knee joint. It was a wonderful project. I would never have looked at the knee joint if I wasn't a Christian, because when I see things in creation, I think, I know that God will have put an amazing design in that particular place. And when I've looked, it's always been amazing. In fact, more amazing than I was expecting. If I was an evolutionist, I wouldn't bother to look in these places. And Andy McIntosh would say exactly the same. He's looked and in detail at parts of creation because he was expecting great design. Raymond Damadian, creationist, one of the amazing designers of the MRI scanners, he was inspired by his belief in creation. In contrast, evolution is terrible for science. One of the reasons scientists labeled junk DNA as junk DNA, because evolution predicts junk DNA would be junk DNA. That held back science because it is not junk DNA, and precious years were wasted when scientists made this absolutely crazy conclusion based on evolutionary thinking. Evolution is terrible for science, so it's ironic that intelligent design has this wrong label. Biblical creation inspired a scientific revolution. Some of the great scientists who believed in biblical creation. This is one I've added recently, and you don't hear a lot about this, but my reading of history is that evolution came through amateur science. These were the champions of creation. James Hutton started belief in an old earth. Charles Lyell extended that. Obviously, Darwin, the theory of evolution, and then people who pushed evolution, Huxley and Lubbock. Look at their education. These were not great scientists. These were not fellows of the Royal Society. These were not people who studied science at Cambridge. Classics, theology, self-taught, a banker. These were amateur scientists. Okay, after Darwin, who were the scientists who believed in biblical creation after Charles Darwin? Lord Kelvin, Fellow of the Royal Society, father of thermodynamics. James Clerk Maxwell, Fellow of the Royal Society, an elder in the Church of Scotland, biblical creationist. Many people would say James Clerk Maxwell is the greatest scientist that ever lived. Even beyond Einstein, he linked magnetism with electricity. James Clerk Maxwell, Sir Ambrose Fleming, Kelvin, Maxwell, Fleming were all at Cambridge, all fellows of the Royal Society, all giants of science. Michael Faraday, another giant of science. On the left, we have these absolute minnows, amateurs. On the right, we have giants, amazing scientists. On the right, they believed in biblical creation. Children and students are not allowed to hear about that. And what did the world choose? It's a bit like when you remember the crowds. Do you want Jesus, Barabbas? Who did they choose? And who did the world choose to choose? The great scientists, all these minnows. And sadly, of course, the world chose the amateurs and the minnows. But now children and students are falsely taught, well, it was, brilliant science that brought in evolution. It wasn't brilliant science at all that brought in evolution. There's no bad design in nature. This is another myth. Richard Dawkins claims the eye is wired backwards because supposedly light has to go through the retina to reach the light-sensitive cells. That's been stated by many evolutionists. It's now been proven to be a catastrophic total error because scientists have discovered these amazing Muller cells in the retina that act like fiber optic cables that guide the light through the retina. It's not degraded, actually improves because of signal conditioning. It blocks reflection of light. It's such a fantastic design that engineers are trying to copy it in the latest optical equipment. In his book, Richard Dawkins says the wiring backwards would be the design of a complete idiot if any creator had created the eye. It has now been proven it's the design of a complete genius that engineers are now trying to copy It's often stated the back is a bad design. Obviously, arthritis, genetic disorders, misuse do cause problems, but in a healthy human back, it is an astoundingly brilliant design. It is so brilliant that the government recently gave over £1 million to a university not so far from here, Southampton University, to do research on how to learn lessons from the brilliance of the human back design to apply it to bridge design. And that's what they're doing at this very moment at Southampton University. Engineers know that the natural world is the gold standard of design, including the human back. The laryngeal nerve, this one is close to my heart. You may have heard Richard Dawkins claim, in the case of the humans or the giraffe or any mammal, he claims the laryngeal nerve is a bad design. Richard Dawkins said, it's a ridiculous detour. So this is the larynx, which I'm struggling with at the moment. And you can see there's one nerve that comes from the brain, but notice there's another one that goes all the way down and then all the way up. This left recurrent laryngeal nerve goes all the way down and all the way up. So Dawkins looks at that and in a split second, that must be a bad design because why would it do this little detour down here? So he says this is ridiculous. Jerry Coyne in the United States, he claims it's one of the worst designs in nature. So this is one of the, supposedly, the greatest evidence for evolution. This is a classic example of bad design. By the way, the evolutionists will often say the design argument is not valid. So you're not allowed to say this is well designed. But how can they use a bad design argument if you can't use a good design argument? That's inconsistent. This is really close to my heart because I showed you earlier the ENVISAT spacecraft, which is about the size of this hall in here. It's a very big spacecraft. I had to do the wiring on that spacecraft. It has about 30 kilometers of wiring. I know, because it took a long time to do it. And that wiring on that spacecraft is one of the most advanced wiring systems that engineers have done. It's at the cutting edge of wiring. So I've always been fascinated at the wiring in the human body. And I've been studying it at the mega conference this year. I did a whole talk on the wiring in the human body. Did you know if you're an adult, you have 150,000 kilometers of wiring in your body? Vastly more than the 30 kilometers of wiring on a spacecraft. And in the mega conference, I was talking about some incredible things that God does in the wiring system in our body, the way you see the bundles, the way they split, the way they mix, the redundancy. It has all the hallmarks of just unbelievable design. Wires, nerves reach every millimeter of your body. It's the most awesome design and just incomprehensible that God could ever do that. He has to be infinite in power and understanding to do that. I think the human nervous system and the way it's integrated with all the other parts of the body, I would say it's one of the most awesome and greatest designs, evidences of design that God has ever done. My colleagues who design spacecraft would agree with what I'm just saying. It's the most incredible design. So it's rather interesting that Dawkins and Coyne claim that this laryngeal nerve, God doesn't know what he's doing with the nervous system. They don't explain any problem with that detour. They just say it looks a bit wrong to them. But as I said earlier, they've never designed anything. They don't understand wiring systems. If they came to my first lecture, because I also lecture students on how to design wiring systems, my first lecture to students, I tell students wiring systems normally have loops. If you looked at the wiring system in this building, you'll see loops all over the place. If you open up the wiring system in a car, there will be loops all over the place. But Richard Dawkins has never studied design. He's never done design. This is part of a spacecraft I designed. I designed this one about 20 years ago. And this is the wires coming from a solar array. There are 300 wires on this spacecraft. And you can see two loops, a loop here and a loop here. I have two loops. And those loops are identical in size and geometry to the loop in the laryngeal nerve in the human body. And I put those loops in for probably very similar reasons why God put a loop in our laryngeal nerve. One of the reasons I had a loop was for intermediate connections. You can see a blue wire here, it's a thermocouple. There's a red wire here, proximity sensor. They couldn't go on their own. They have to piggyback a bigger bundle of wires. So by putting in a loop, I can get these tiny wires to these intermediate connections. I have redundancy. I have two sets of wires, one on one side, one on another. If a meteorite strike knocks out one, I know I've got another. It allows motion of this hinge, and there are assembly constraints. I have to think of how the technician is going to get all the wires in that place. And if everything is tight, they can't physically create the whole system. When I look at the human throat, I see all four of those things, all of them apply, because this loop has intermediate connections to the esophagus, trachea, and some other things. It has redundancy. If you injure your throat, you're very unlikely to destroy both of those wires. People don't often lose their voice. They have partial problems if one of these breaks. By splitting the wires, it gives a bit more motion in the throat, and there are assembly constraints. When a baby grows in the womb, all the organs have to move apart, and you have to have loops in various bits of the nervous system, otherwise the organs are too constrained and they cannot move apart. So if you actually know something about wiring systems, and then you analyze this, you see it is exactly what you would expect. But if you have no knowledge of these things, then you could be tempted to say this is, the worst kind of design. They don't know anything about how things should be designed. The appendix has now been shown to have an important role in the immune system. You can survive without it, but you're better off with it, especially if you're a child. Biblical creation is tolerant, whilst evolution is not. And I just give you some personal examples of intimidation. Because if you are a creation scientist and you enter academia, you are told not to defend intelligent design. You are allowed to criticize intelligent design. You are absolutely not allowed to defend it. These kind of ridiculing comments, if you doubt evolution, you're stupid or insane. In a way, it's funny. But if you're a biology academic trying to get a post in a university, it's not very nice if you think that's how you'll be labeled if you declare your interest in belief in creation or the Bible. If you know that's how you're going to be labeled. These things are very intimidating if you're an academic. It's bullying, and it's really serious. So I was once reading the Times newspaper. My colleague in the coffee room was reading it, and he said, someone is in trouble. Intelligent design is creeping onto courses. And I said, who is that? And he said, well, inside is your picture and Andy McIntosh. So it's you. It's been nice knowing you. But I managed to keep my job after that one. Andy Mack and myself were not promoting intelligent design, but any hint that we might, and it was getting into headlines. A similar thing in the Telegraph. So this is a picture of me and the academics preaching intelligent design. So they said I was preaching intelligent design in universities. They also said I was a pin-up boy for creationists. So that wasn't. I haven't been a pin-up boy before, so that wasn't so bad. Then Richard Dawkins has targeted Andy McIntosh and myself in The Guardian. There have been some quite strong attacks. So he says it's important to understand the sheer magnitude of the errors that Burgess and Mackintosh are making. I'll quote more of him a bit later. But a lot of evolutionists have written to my university demanding that I do not put my qualifications on my books. And I'll show you about 3 examples. This evolutionist is very famous. He's world famous for dinosaur design. And he said he's concerned that Burgess is putting Bristol University and his qualifications on his books. Well, I'm a professor of engineering design, and I research design and engineering and nature. So my qualifications are absolutely connected with the topic hallmarks of design. But they, even talking today in this church, he said I shouldn't even mention Bristol University, even if I'm speaking in this church. Why? The reason is they want me to separate science from faith. They want me to give the impression there's no connection between science and my faith. They want me to give the impression that I believe in the Bible despite what science says. They're desperate for me not to connect. And they want to promote the myth that no scientist believes in intelligent design. And if I write these books and I put my qualifications on, that it's going to attack that myth that they're trying to put forward. Another very senior scientist wrote to my university saying, he shouldn't put it on his books, and it's not linked to what he's employed to do. He's not paid to think about intelligent design. He's just paid to design things, study design in nature, but he's not paid to think about there could be a God who did that. Despite the fact that people like Isaac Newton were happy to talk about their belief in God all through their lectures, courses, books. Dawkins can mention atheism in his lectures every week, but I'm not allowed to do that at all. I'll come back to this one later because this particular journalist wrote to the Vice-Chancellor and said, does the university approve its name being attached to those books? If it does not approve of that, what action does it intend to take to ensure this is not done again? So quite a few people have said, you need to take action against this intelligent design fanatic working in your university. And then various complaints. I sometimes get emails from editors saying, the accusations, you always stress your religious views. In one lecture, I'd just been lecturing on design in the human back, and I said, oh, by the way, this weekend, I'm actually giving a talk in a church, just on the same topic, design in the back, but you'll see it from another point of view. And I just said one sentence, and I was reported to the university and to the press for saying that one single sentence. So then I realized I was being monitored, and you cannot mention God in a lecture or people just go mad. Not so far from here, I don't know how far Winchester is from here, but when I went there was an almighty protest by the Winchester humanists, their group, and afterwards they created this 10,000-word website dissecting all the things they didn't like about my talk. They even wrote to my university and got interviews from the head of biology and head of paleontology to say what they thought, and they created a leaflet that was handed out to everyone who entered the lecture. This is an example of a threatening email I had from an atheist organization. They've heard that I welcome discussion with your students. We would consider that situation being very serious and would seek to ensure you are called to account for speaking about design in nature. As always, we wish to be fair before proceeding to the next stage. They never told me what the next stage was, abduction or assassination. I just had to wait to see what the next stage was. Lots of those kind of abusive emails, atheists getting very angry, any hint that I might talk about intelligent design. You might have heard of the British Centre for Science Education. It's a very dangerous organisation because it's a fanatical atheist group who hide behind a scientific label. And at the bottom it says, fighting against creationism in the UK. And they said, apart from saying Burgess is the most dangerous man in the United Kingdom, they said, we plan to write to the head of department at his university to tell them about his creationist beliefs. I did not know they were going to do this. And they did do this, and it caused me an immense amount of embarrassment, partly because I didn't know it was coming. So this is Sir Michael Berry, Fellow of the Royal Society, the most famous professor at Bristol University in physics. And he wrote to me and he said, "Is it true you think I work for the devil?" And when he said that, I thought, but where's he got this from? I didn't have any idea where this had come from. When I spoke to him, we got into conversation, actually became a bit friendly, and then I realized where it had come from, and he hadn't realized that it was an atheist organization that had this British Centre for Science Education. But I just mentioned the final section, encouragements. So Michael Berry came to my professorial inaugural lecture. He'd never been to any other engineering professorial lecture. And he wrote to me and said he enjoyed it and liked the style and content. So that backfired on that atheist organization. But there were other heads of department I couldn't speak to who had been written to, stirring up trouble. In April 2007, I was invited to Parliament to talk about education of origins, and the MPs asked me about intimidation. They were horrified when they heard what actually goes on in academia. The reason this intimidation is so important, if evolutionists were confident in their theory, they would not bully and intimidate the opposition. And if they believed in true science, they would not bully and intimidate people. Because I can tell you, for every one academic who shares their faith, talks about their interest in intelligent design, there are something like 500 or 1,000 who keep their head down. So the public think, hardly any academics believe in God, but that's not true. They are forced to keep quiet. I should say, it was never my great plan to witness in 2000. That's when I wrote my book, Hallmarks of Design, and I was told, do not publish that book. And if you really want to publish that book, wait till you're retired. But I was 37 in 2000, and I thought, I can't wait 20, however many years to publish this book, Hallmarks of Design. I just went ahead and did it, because I'd already written the book. But it wasn't my plan to speak out for God. But having dived into the water, I thought, well, I've done it now, so I may as well go around telling everyone, you should believe in intelligent design. Another encouragement, I was invited to speak, to write something in The Independent. So the media is not totally biased, but mostly it just likes a really simple story and it toes the evolution line. But occasionally journalists will say, hang on, there is another view. So I gave that in The Independent. My testimony is that God has been an incredible help to me. There was a time when I had a really rough time, and the Dean of Engineering was protecting my job. I didn't know he was protecting my job for about 6 months, and someone said, Stuart, you don't know this, but for the last 6 months, the Dean of Engineering has said he will defend you to the death, because there are other departments and evolutionists who say you should be dealt with, disciplined, sacked. But the dean, who's not a Christian, is absolutely defending you, and God has used non-Christians to defend me in my job. I'll give another example later. And in times when things have got really tough, a good research contract has come along, like Team GB, the Olympic bike, and my testimony is God has been an incredible help to me. 2 days ago, I was in Manchester, and I received the James Clayton Prize and £10,000. It's basically the top mechanical engineer in the country. Previous winners have been Sir Frank Whittle, design of the jet engine, and I received that prize 2 days ago, so that will keep me in my job for at least 3 years now, I think. But it's these kind of things this is one of the reasons the atheists hate me and my witness, and they really wish they could just keep me quiet and stop mentioning my support of intelligent design. I was talking about all those emails to my university saying to the Vice-Chancellor's office, you have to stop Burgess putting his name on his books and his qualifications. That's the Wonders of Creation book. And it came to the point where the Vice-Chancellor had to make a decision because he's getting all these emails saying this is what Burgess believes. The Vice-Chancellor has a very good knowledge of biblical creation because everyone has told him what I believe about biblical creation. So he had to come to this decision. So he made a response to that journalist, and I'll show you the response. The Vice-Chancellor's office, he always writes an email in capital letters, so I haven't capitalized this. This is his. So just to show you each section. So this was the first challenge from that journalist. Is the University of Bristol aware that Professor Burgess is giving this kind of advertising on his creationist writing by putting that I'm a professor at Bristol University? And I was copied into this response from the Vice-Chancellor's office. I was very nervous. Was I going to be told I have to stop putting my name on the book? The atheist groups were dying to know what was Vice-Chancellor was going to say. So this is what he said. We do not regard this as advertising. It is a statement of fact. Professor Burgess does indeed work at Bristol University. So I was extremely thankful to God when I saw that. But he went on, does the university approve of its name being attached to this publication? It would be difficult to object to a statement of fact. As I said earlier, Professor Burgess does work here. If it does endorse this material, on what scientifically accepted principles? Not applicable, see earlier response. If it does not endorse this material, what action does it intend to take to ensure its name is not used in this way? Not applicable, see earlier response. So I was very, very relieved, and the atheist organizations were very unhappy. So since then, my first slide has Bristol University on the very first slide, and my books. I had a lot of support from students. I've given a few talks in my university and other universities, and basically after I give a talk, then the talks are banned after that point. But the students complain, even the non-Christian students complain, and they want to hear about this interesting evidence for design. It's really good to have a debate, and the students are really irritated that creationists are not allowed to speak in universities. It's just banned from that. So I've been really encouraged by the support from the students. Interestingly, the students have said to me they're not so much interested in all the facts, but they're interested in the emotion. Why do these evolutionists get so angry? And it makes them really interested to find out more about origins. The Team GB work has been really encouraging. There was a record number of medals at the Rio Olympics, and since then they've done really well in the World Championships. They released a picture of the new bike last week. In the next talk I might show you a picture of that, and it has the new chain system that I've just designed, so that's quite exciting for the Tokyo Olympics. I was invited to exhibit at the Royal Society Summer Science Exhibition in 2017. In particular, a new testing system I designed for the chain was judged to be one of the biggest science breakthroughs in the UK for 2017. So I exhibited it at the Royal Society, 14,000 visitors in 7 days. Team GB said, don't tell people the secret. Everyone will say, what is the secret to the chain? And you mustn't say anything about the secret. So I said, don't worry, I know exactly what to say. So when people ask me, well, what is the secret? I said, it is a biblical worldview. That is the secret to Team GB in the Rio Olympics. Had a lot of confusion there. I've just done a tour of Germany, and I teased them because I did tell them one of the secrets. One of the secrets to our transmission, we get some of the components made in Germany, a secret factory deep in the forest. of Bavaria. And so I told the Germans we used German engineering to beat the German team. So there was a VIP evening at the Royal Society. This is a picture, me, one of the researchers, and the Minister of State for the Treasury. Had a thank you from her. After she went, I spoke to this gentleman who for 20 minutes wanted to speak about nothing but his bicycles. He asked me for advice on his commuter bike, his weekend bike, his touring bike, how to rearrange all the gearing. And after 20 minutes, and I said, but who are you? And he said, I'm Sir David Ramsden, Chief Economic Advisor to the Treasury. I've just been with Philip Hammond, but I'd much rather talk about bicycles at the moment. So that was a really interesting week. And I've mentioned this a few times in my talks, but someone sent a copy of my book to Prince Charles, Hallmarks of Design, and he didn't have a clue what he was doing, but he decided to quote from it in his Wreath lectures, because he was trying to promote loving the natural world, creation, so he thought I should quote from Stuart's book. So he said, why should modern science rule out special creation? Which is just a fantastic quote, because that's exactly the massive mistake of modern science, ruling out special creation. And it created a big stir, especially in the Times newspaper. But as I say, he didn't really understand what he was doing. And I said to my friend, it was very brave of him to do that. And my friend said, it wasn't brave at all. He cannot be sacked or demoted. I mentioned before, God has used non-Christians to keep me in my job. Someone just recently, like just over a year ago, someone said, you have to look at the Winchester Humanist website, because did you know your boss, this is a different, not the dean, but head of school, a very senior professor at Bristol, did you know he was supporting you on this humanist website? And I was really surprised, because my boss never told me that he did this, and this was years ago that he did this. And I won't write it all, but he said to these humanists, I know Stuart Burgess, he is a colleague. What he should have said is he works for me. He said, I'm not a Christian, I'm not an intelligent design believer, but Professor Burgess is a professor of design, his work is very clever. And contrast this with Richard Dawkins, who is a professor of public understanding of science, i.e. pushing his opinions on the public. I personally find it deeply offensive that Dawkins' God delusion opinion should be called science and Stuart Burgess' opinion should be called dangerous or laughable. And there are other examples of non-Christian academics who've really watched my back and have supported me. And I think that's God who's done that. Just to mention a verse from Isaiah, just to read the last bit. Notice at the end how it says, God turns wise men backward and makes their knowledge foolishness. And when it comes to evolution, a lot of this involves knowledge going backwards and foolishness. It's not just 2 Corinthians, the God of this world blinding the world. In a way, you can also see it as judgment. But the final slide, I just let Dawkins give him the last word. In relationship problems, it's often good to give the other person the last word, so I'll let Dawkins have the last word. Maybe Burgess and Mackintosh are right about evolution, and all the rest of us, biologists, geologists, archaeologists, historians, chemists, physicists, cosmologists, thermodynamicists, respectable theologians. The vast majority of Nobel Prize winners, that's not true actually, fellows of the Royal Society, the National Academies of the world are wrong about evolution, maybe. Not just slightly wrong, but catastrophically, appallingly, devastatingly wrong. If Burgess and Mackintosh are right, the scientific establishment has fallen. I agree with him on that. Yeah.